My name's Emily, and I'm 32. Last Thanksgiving, I walked into my mother-in-law Linda's dining room, expecting warmth, maybe even family. Instead, she handed me a pink cartoon plate, her smile sharp as a knife. "Since you can't give my son kids," she said, "you might as well eat like one." The room went quiet. My heart pounded, but I stayed calm, clutching my purse where a letter waited a secret that could change everything. Have you ever been blindsided like that? Drop a like if you've felt this sting and subscribe to hear how I turned the tables. The silence after Linda's jab hung heavy like the steam rising from the turkey platter. I sat there, my fingers brushing the edge of that ridiculous cartoon plate, its faded princess staring up at me. My cheeks burned, but I forced my hands to move, scooping a small mound of mashed potatoes onto the plate. The clink of my spoon against the cheap plastic echoed in my ears louder than it should have been. Around the table, everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for me to crack. James, my husband, sat to my left, his eyes fixed on his own plate, his jaw tight. I wanted him to look at me, to say something, anything. But he just shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Linda sat at the head of the table, her lips curled in a satisfied little smirk, like she'd won some game I didn't know we were playing. She reached for the gravy boat, her gold bracelet glinting under the chandelier, and started serving herself as if nothing had happened. The normalcy of it made my stomach twist. How could she just move on after slicing me open in front of everyone? I glanced around, hoping someone would break the tension. Margaret, Linda's older sister, fidgeted with her napkin, her eyes darting between me and Linda. She let out a nervous laugh, the kind that grates more than it soothes. "Oh, Linda, you're too much sometimes," Margaret said, her voice high and shaky. She reached for the cranberry sauce, her hands trembling slightly. "Let's just enjoy this beautiful meal, shall we?" I wanted to scream, "Enjoy!" My throat tightened as I swallowed the urge to snap back. Instead, I nodded, my lips pressed into a thin smile that felt more like a grimace. "Sure, Margaret," I said softly, my voice steadier than I felt. I couldn't let Linda see me unravel. Not yet. Linda leaned back in her chair, her eyes glinting with something sharp. "Just keeping it real, dear," she said, her tone syrupy sweet but laced with venom. She cut into her turkey, the knife scraping against her plate. "No need to make a fuss." A fuss. As if her words hadn't just carved a hole in my chest. I looked at James again, willing him to meet my gaze. His fork hovered over his green beans, but he didn't lift his head. My heart sank deeper. We'd been married 5 years, and I'd always thought we were a team. But now, with his mother's words hanging between us, his silence felt like a betrayal all its own. I thought of the letter in my purse, tucked against the lining, its weight, a quiet promise. I'd carried it for months, waiting for the right moment. Was this it? My pulse quickened at the thought, but I pushed it down. Not yet. I needed to get through this dinner first. Across the table, Caleb, James's younger cousin, leaned forward, his smirk matching Linda's. He was in his early 20s, all sharp angles and careless confidence, the kind of guy who thrived on stirring the pot. "So, Emily," he said, his voice loud enough to draw eyes, "you liking that plate? Bet it brings back memories, huh?" He chuckled, popping a roll into his mouth. My fingers tightened around my spoon. Memories. He didn't know the half of it. The doctor's visits, the tests, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, while James slept soundly beside me. Caleb's words weren't just a jab. They were a reminder of every loss I'd buried. I opened my mouth to respond, but James finally spoke, his voice low, barely audible. "Babe, just let it go." He whispered, his hand brushing my knee under the table. His touch was meant to comfort, but it felt like a leash holding me back from saying what I wanted to scream. Let it go. How could I, when Linda had just painted a target on my back, when he hadn't even tried to defend me? I pulled my knee away, my chest tight with a mix of hurt and anger. "I'm fine, James," I said. My voice clipped. I wasn't fine, not even close, but I couldn't let him see that. Not here, not now. I turned my attention back to my plate, pushing the potatoes around my appetite gone. The room buzzed with small talk as the family tried to move past the moment, but it was like trying to ignore a storm cloud hanging over the table. Margaret started rambling about her garden, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to fill the silence. Linda chimed in, her voice bright as if she hadn't just humiliated me in front of everyone. I tuned them out, my eyes drifting to a framed photo on the wall behind Linda. It was James as a kid, maybe 6 or 7, grinning with a missing front tooth, his arms wrapped around Linda's waist. She looked so proud, so possessive even then. That photo was a reminder of what this was really about. To Linda, James was her legacy, her golden boy, and I was the one standing in the way of her perfect vision of a family. She'd never said it outright before tonight, but I'd felt it in every backhanded comment, every pointed question about when we'd start a family. Now she'd stopped pretending. My mind flashed to the first time I'd met Linda 6 years ago at a barbecue in her backyard. She'd been charming then, all smiles and warm hugs. But even that day, she'd asked if I was ready for kids someday. I'd laughed it off, thinking it was just small talk. Now I saw it for what it was, a test I'd been failing ever since. The memory made my chest ache, but it also steeled me. I wasn't the fragile girl she thought I was. I'd been through too much, carried too many scars to let her break me now. I took a sip of water, the cold glass grounding me. I needed to stay sharp to keep my emotions in check. The letter was still there waiting, but I couldn't act impulsively. Not with Caleb watching me like a hawk, not with Margaret's nervous glances, not with James's silence weighing on me like a stone. I had to play this smart for my own sake. But as Linda's laughter rang out sharp and careless, something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about surviving dinner anymore. It was about surviving her. I forced myself to take a bite of the mashed potatoes, but they tasted like ash in my mouth. The dining room chatter had picked up again, a fragile attempt to pretend Linda's words hadn't left a wound. I kept my eyes on my plate, the cartoon princess now smeared with gravy, her faded crown, a cruel mirror of my own tarnished place at this table. My hands itched to reach for my purse, to pull out the letter and end this farce, but I clenched them in my lap instead. Timing was everything, and I wasn't ready to play my hand. Linda's voice cut through the hum of conversation, bright and commanding, as she started telling a story about James's childhood. He was always such a charmer, she said, her eyes sparkling with pride. Even at 10, he'd have the whole neighborhood eating out of his hand. She glanced at me, her smile tightening. Of course, a man like that needs a certain kind of woman to keep up. The words landed like a slap, subtle enough to pass as a compliment to anyone not paying close attention. But I felt their weight, the implication that I wasn't that woman. My stomach churned, and I set my fork down, the metal clinking softly against the plate. I looked at James, hoping for a flicker of acknowledgement, but he was nodding along to his mother's story, a faint smile on his lips. It was like he hadn't even heard her. Or maybe he had, and he just didn't care. Margaret cleared her throat, her voice wobbling as she tried to steer the conversation. James was a handful, though, wasn't he? Always getting into trouble with those bikes. She laughed, but it was brittle, and no one joined in. Caleb, sitting across from me, leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with mischief. He'd been quiet for a moment, but I could see the gears turning in his head, ready to stir things up again. "Hey, Aunt Linda," he said, his tone casual but pointed. "You ever think James might have settled down too soon? I mean, he's got all that charm, right? Could have had anyone." He shot me a quick glance, his smirk barely hidden. The room stilled again, forks pausing midair. My chest tightened, a hot flush creeping up my neck. Caleb wasn't just poking at me now. He was questioning my place in James's life right here in front of everyone. I opened my mouth to respond, but Linda beat me to it. "Oh, Caleb, don't be silly," she said, her laugh sharp and dismissive. James made his choice. "We all make do with what we've got." Her eyes flicked to me, lingering just long enough to make her meaning clear. I was the compromise, the lesser option she'd been forced to accept. My fingers dug into my thighs, the pain grounding me as I fought to keep my face neutral. James finally looked up, his brow furrowing. "Mom, come on," he said, his voice low, but there was no heat in it, no real defense. It was a half-hearted attempt, and it stung more than his silence had. I wanted to grab his hand to demand he stand up for me, but the weight of the moment held me still. I could feel the eyes of the table on me waiting for a reaction, and I hated how exposed I felt, like a specimen under glass. Sarah James's quiet cousin sat to my right, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't said much all evening, but now she caught my eye, her expression soft, with something like pity. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline in the sea of judgment around me. I gave her a faint nod, grateful for the silent support, even if it couldn't undo the damage. My mind drifted to the letter again. Its words burned into my memory. I'd read it so many times, the paper soft from my fingers, tracing the doctor's neat handwriting. It wasn't just a medical report. It was proof that Linda's accusations were built on lies, that the truth was more complicated than her cruel narrative. But using it would mean exposing James too, and I wasn't sure I could do that to him. Not yet. The thought made my throat ache, a mix of loyalty and resentment tangling inside me. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. "I need some air," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm in my chest. I didn't wait for a response, just stood and walked toward the kitchen, my steps measured. The dining room voices faded behind me, replaced by the hum of the refrigerator as I stepped into the quiet space. I leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the cool granite, and closed my eyes. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and roasted herbs, a cruel contrast to the bitterness I felt. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to win Linda over, the countless dinners where I'd bitten my tongue, the holidays where I'd smiled through her veiled insults. I'd told myself it was for James, that keeping the peace was worth it. But now, with her words ringing in my ears and his silence echoing in my heart, I wasn't so sure. I opened my eyes, catching my reflection in the dark window above the sink. My face looked tired, but there was a spark of something else there too. Resolve, maybe. Or anger. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Sarah hovering in the doorway, her arms crossed. "You okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Linda's always been like this," she said. "But tonight, she's out of line. We all see it." Her words were a small comfort, but they didn't erase the ache. "Thanks," I said, my voice hoarse. I don't know how much more I can take." Sarah's eyes softened, and for a moment I thought she might say more, but the sound of Linda's laughter from the dining room cut through the quiet, sharp and careless. It was like a match to kindling, igniting something fierce inside me. I straightened my hands, falling to my sides. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. I stood in Linda's kitchen, the counter cold under my palms. Sarah's words still lingering. Her quiet support was a flicker of light, but it wasn't enough to dull the sharp edge of Linda's laughter echoing from the dining room. I took a deep breath, the scent of cinnamon now cloying, and straightened my shoulders. I had to go back out there, had to face her. My purse sat on the counter, where I'd left it, the letter inside a silent pulse in my mind. I touched the strap briefly, then let my hand fall. Not yet. As I walked back to the dining room, the chatter grew louder, a forced kind of normalcy that made my skin crawl. The table was a mess of half-eaten plates and wine glasses, the chandelier casting jagged shadows across the scene. I slid into my seat, avoiding James's glance. He was picking at his pie now, his fork scraping the plate in a way that set my teeth on edge. Linda was holding court again, her voice bright as she recounted some story about her garden club. But her eyes flicked to me as I sat, and I knew she wasn't done. She leaned forward, her bracelet clinking against her glass. "Emily, dear," she said, her tone dripping with false warmth. "You've barely touched your food. Not feeling nurturing tonight, are we?" The words were a blade wrapped in a smile, and they cut deeper than her earlier jab. A few heads turned, and I felt the weight of their stares like I was on trial. My throat burned, but I kept my voice even. "Just savoring the moment, Linda," I said, pushing a cold green bean around my plate. The cartoon princess stared up at me, her faded smile mocking. I wanted to flip the plate over to shatter the pretense, but I gripped my fork instead, the metal biting into my palm. Caleb, never one to miss a chance to stir the pot, piped up from across the table. "Aunt Linda, you're on fire tonight," he said, grinning like a kid who'd just set off a firecracker. He turned to me, his eyes glinting. "Come on, Emily, you gotta admit she's got a point. Big family like this, everyone's gotta pull their weight, right?" His words were playful, but they landed like a punch, implying I was failing some unspoken test. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with expectation. I looked at Sarah, hoping for another glance of solidarity, but she was staring at her lap, her fingers twisting her napkin. Margaret coughed, reaching for her water, her face flushed with discomfort. James's fork stilled, but he didn't speak, didn't even look at me. The silence from him was louder than Caleb's taunt, heavier than Linda's smirk. My chest ached, a raw, twisting pain that made it hard to breathe. I thought of the years I'd spent trying to fit into this family, the way I'd memorized Linda's recipes, laughed at her stories, even bought her favorite flowers for her birthday. All of it just to be reduced to this, a woman who couldn't pull her weight because of something I couldn't control. The injustice of it burned a slow fire, spreading through me. I wanted to scream at Linda, to tell her she didn't know me, didn't know the half of what I'd carried. But I swallowed it, my jaw tight, because losing control now would only give her more ammunition. Linda tilted her head, her smile widening. "Oh, don't take it personally," she said, waving a hand as if she hadn't just twisted the knife. "Some women just aren't cut out for certain roles. It's no shame to know your limits." Her words were sugar-coated poison, and the way she leaned back satisfied made my blood boil. She thought she had me cornered, that I'd just sit here and take it. I opened my mouth, searching for a response that wouldn't betray the storm inside me, but Caleb cut in again. "Hey, Aunt Linda, you ever tell Emily about that time you planned James's whole future?" he said, his tone teasing but sharp. "You know, the big house, the kids, the whole deal? Bet that's still the dream, huh?" He shot me a look, daring me to react. My heart pounded a deafening rhythm in my ears. Caleb's words weren't just a jab. They were a spotlight on Linda's obsession, the one she'd been wielding against me for years. I saw it now, clear as day, the big house, the kids, the legacy she'd mapped out for James, with no room for me unless I fit her mold. And I didn't. I never would. The realization hit like a wave, drowning out the chatter, the clinking glasses, the pretense of this so-called family dinner. I glanced at the photo on the wall, the one of James as a kid, his grin frozen in time. It wasn't just a memory. It was a shrine to Linda's control, a reminder that I was an intruder in her story. My fingers twitched, itching to reach for my purse, to pull out the letter and shatter her perfect narrative. But I held back, my breath shallow. I needed to stay sharp, to wait for the right moment, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the truth, and I was done letting her bury it. The air in the dining room felt thicker now, like I was breathing through a wet cloth. Caleb's words about legacy still echoed, each syllable a nail in the coffin of my composure. Linda's necklace glinted as she leaned back, her eyes locked on me, daring me to crumble. James's hand, still frozen on the table, was a silent betrayal that cut deeper than anything she'd said. I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of their judgment, the years of swallowing my pain, the letter burning a hole in my purse, it all collided, a spark, igniting something I couldn't hold back. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loud enough to make Margaret flinch. My hands trembled as I stood, but my voice was steady, sharper than I'd expected. "Linda, you've had your say," I said, my eyes meeting hers. "Now it's my turn." The room went still, forks clattering to plates, wine glasses forgotten. Even Caleb's smirk faltered, his bravado shrinking under the sudden shift. I reached for my purse, my fingers brushing the worn leather, and pulled out the letter. It was creased and soft, carried for months like a secret I'd both cherished and feared. My heart pounded a drumbeat, drowning out the whispers starting to ripple around the table. I held the paper up, its edges catching the chandelier's light, and for a moment I hesitated. This was it. No going back. But Linda's smug expression, the way she tilted her head like I was a child throwing a tantrum, pushed me over the edge. "This," I said, my voice rising, "is why your son doesn't have kids yet." I unfolded the letter, my hands steady now, driven by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The words were familiar, etched into my memory from countless sleepless nights, but saying them aloud felt like breaking a dam. "It's a medical report, not mine, James's." I paused, letting the weight of it sink in, watching Linda's face drain of color, her lips parting in shock. The room erupted in gasps, a sharp intake of breath from Sarah, a choked sound from Margaret. Caleb's chair creaked as he leaned forward, his eyes wide, no trace of his earlier cockiness. I didn't look at James. I couldn't. Not yet. My focus was on Linda, on the woman who'd spent years blaming me, shaming me, when the truth was something she'd never bothered to question. I started reading, my voice clear and deliberate, each word a release of the pain I'd carried. Low sperm motility diagnosed 2 years ago. Recommended treatment, lifestyle changes, possible medical intervention. My throat tightened, but I kept going, the clinical terms, a strange contrast to the raw emotion in my chest. Prognosis uncertain, but not impossible with effort. I lowered the paper, my eyes locked on Linda's. "You've been wrong about me this whole time." The silence that followed was deafening, a void where Linda's control used to be. Her hands gripped the table, her knuckles white, her necklace suddenly looking heavy, like it might choke her. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her composure cracking for the first time all night. I felt a surge of vindication, a rush so powerful it made my head spin. For once, she had no words, no defense, no way to twist this back on me. Sarah's eyes were wet, her hand pressed to her mouth, and Margaret was staring at the tablecloth. Her face flushed with something like shame. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his bravado gone, replaced by a flicker of guilt. But it was James I needed to face now, and the thought made my stomach lurch. I turned to him, my heart in my throat, and saw his face pale and stricken, his eyes fixed on the letter in my hand. "Emily," he said, his voice barely a whisper, raw with something I couldn't name. Hurt, anger. I didn't know, and it scared me. I'd protected his secret for so long, carried it like a weight to spare him this moment, but I couldn't carry Linda's lies anymore. My chest ached with the cost of it, the love I still felt for him warring with the betrayal of his silence. I wanted to say more, to explain why I'd done it, but Linda found her voice, her words sharp and desperate. "This is nonsense," She snapped her chair, scraping as she stood. "You're making this up to embarrass me, to tear this family apart." Her voice cracked, but her eyes were fire, refusing to back down even now. She pointed at the letter, her hand trembling. "That can't be true. My son is perfect." The accusation stung, but it was weaker than her earlier jabs, a last-ditch effort to cling to her narrative. I shook my head, my voice softer now, almost pitying. "It's true, Linda, and I've got the doctor's signature to prove it." I held the letter out, offering it to her, but she recoiled like it was poison. The gesture felt symbolic, a rejection of the truth she'd spent years avoiding. The room was chaos, now voices overlapping, questions flying. Margaret stammered something about needing water, her hands shaking as she reached for her glass. Sarah whispered my name, her voice thick with emotion, but I barely heard her. My eyes were on James on the way. His shoulders slumped, his hands clenched in his lap. I'd wanted to hurt Linda to stop her cruelty, but seeing him like this felt like a knife in my own chest. Had I gone too far? The question clawed at me, but there was no time to answer. The truth was out, and the fallout was just beginning. The letter lay on the floor, its edges curled like a fallen leaf, and the silence in the dining room was a living thing pressing against my skin. Linda's accusation hung sharpest, her claim that I'd fabricated the letter, slicing through the chaos. My arm was still outstretched, the medical report trembling slightly in my grip, but she wouldn't take it. Her refusal felt like a wall, unyielding and cold, and for a moment I wondered if I'd miscalculated. Could she really deny this even now? My chest tightened, the air too thin as I lowered the paper. My eyes still locked on hers. James's voice broke through louder this time, raw and jagged. "Emily, why?" He stood his chair, tipping back with a thud that made Sarah jump. His face was a mask of hurt eyes wide with betrayal, and it hit me harder than Linda's venom ever could. "You didn't have to do this. Not like this." His words were a plea, but they carried an edge, like I'd crossed a line he'd never forgive. I opened my mouth, my throat burning, but nothing came out. I wanted to tell him I had no choice, that his silence had forced my hand, but the weight of his gaze stopped me. The room spun, the faces around me, blurring Margaret's flushed cheeks, Caleb's stunned silence, Sarah's tear-streaked eyes. They were all watching, witnesses to a moment I'd never meant to unfold like this. My victory over Linda felt hollow now, tainted by the pain in James's voice. Linda seized the opening, her voice rising shrill and commanding. "This is what you do. You come into my home, my family, and air our private matters like some cheap drama." She stepped around the table, her heels clicking on the hardwood, closing the distance between us. "You think this makes you right? You're nothing but a troublemaker, Emily, and you've just proven it." Her finger jabbed the air, inches from my face, her necklace swinging like a pendulum. The accusation was a gut punch, twisting the truth into something ugly. I wasn't the troublemaker. She was the one who'd turned this dinner into a battlefield. But her words found their mark, feeding the doubt clawing at me. Had I gone too far? Was this my fault? My legs wobbled, but I locked my knees, refusing to let her see me falter. The letter was still in my hand, its creases damp from my grip, a fragile anchor in the storm. Sarah stood, her voice shaky but firm. "Linda, stop it. You pushed her to this." Her words were a spark of defiance, but Linda rounded on, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare defend her, Sarah. You've always been too soft." The dismissal was brutal, and Sarah shrank back, her courage crumbling under Linda's glare. I wanted to reach for her, to thank her for trying, but I was frozen, trapped in the crossfire of Linda's wrath and James's pain. Caleb, of all people, spoke up, his voice low, almost hesitant. Aunt Linda, maybe? Maybe you went too far tonight. It was a crack in his usual bravado, a flicker of remorse that stunned me. But Linda didn't flinch. Stay out of this, Caleb, she snapped, her authority absolute. This is between me and her. Her eyes swung back to me, and the venom in them made my skin crawl. You think you've won? You've just shown everyone who you really are. Her words were a mirror reflecting my worst fears. Was this who I was now? The woman who'd aired her husband's secrets to humiliate his mother. The thought made my stomach lurch, a wave of shame crashing over me. I looked at James, desperate for a sign he understood, but his face was closed off, his hands clenched at his sides. The man I'd loved, the one I'd vowed to stand by, was slipping away, and I didn't know how to stop it. The table was a graveyard of abandoned plates, the pumpkin pie half-eaten, the wine glasses smudged with fingerprints. The warmth of Thanksgiving, the promise of family, had been gutted, replaced by this raw, ugly truth. I thought of the letter's origin, the sterile doctor's office, where James had sat head in his hands begging me to keep it quiet. I'd agreed not just for him, but for us to protect what we had. Now that promise lay in pieces, scattered across this table like the crumbs of Margaret's pie. Linda took another step toward me, her voice dropping to a hiss. You'll regret this, Emily. You think you can humiliate my son and walk away. This family will never forget what you've done. Her threat was a blade cold and precise, and it cut through the last of my defenses. I felt exposed raw, like every wound I'd ever carried was laid bare for this room to judge. My eyes stung, but I blinked hard, refusing to let her see tears. I wanted to scream that she was the one who'd started this, that her cruelty had driven me to this point. But my voice was gone, swallowed by the weight of James's hurt, Linda's rage, and the suffocating realization that I might have broken something irreparable. The letter slipped from my fingers, fluttering to the floor. Its truth, no longer a weapon, but a burden I couldn't carry alone. I stood there, heart pounding, soul cracked open with nowhere left to hide. The letter lay on the floor, its edges curled like a fallen leaf, and the silence in the dining room was a living thing pressing against my skin. Linda's threat echoed in my ears, her words a promise of retribution, but it was James's face that held me captive. His eyes, once my safe harbor, were stormy with hurt, and the distance between us felt like a chasm I couldn't cross. My legs trembled, but something inside me shifted, a spark of resolve flickering through the fog of shame and fear. I couldn't let this moment define me. Not anymore. I straightened my hands, steadying as I met Linda's gaze. You're wrong about me, I said, my voice low but firm, each word a stone laid in a new foundation. I'm not the one tearing this family apart. You did that long before tonight. The room stirred, a ripple of surprise passing through the faces around me. Sarah's eyes widened, her hands unclenching, and even Caleb's jaw tightened, his earlier bravado gone. Linda's lips parted, but I didn't give her a chance to respond. I turned to James, my heart pounding, but my resolve unbroken. And you, I said, my voice catching but not breaking, you let this happen. You let her blame me, humiliate me, when you knew the truth. My words were a blade sharp, with years of unspoken pain, and I saw him flinch, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't carry his silence anymore. I stepped back, my heels clicking on the hardwood, and grabbed my purse from the counter where I'd left it. The leather was cool against my palm, grounding me as I faced the table again. I've spent years trying to fit into this family, I said, my voice rising clear and unwavering. I've cooked your recipes, Linda. I've listened to your stories, smiled through every jab. But I'm done begging for a place at this table. My eyes swept the room, taking in Margaret's flushed cheeks, Sarah's quiet nod, Caleb's averted gaze. I deserve better. The words felt like a release, a weight lifting from my chest. I wasn't just speaking to Linda or James. I was speaking to myself, reclaiming the part of me I'd buried to keep the peace. My mother's voice echoed in my mind, a memory from years ago when she'd tucked a locket into my hand and told me to never let anyone dim my light. I'd forgotten that strength, but now it surged back warm and fierce, like a fire rekindled. Linda recovered her voice sharp as she stepped toward me. "You think you can just walk away after this? You've shamed my son, my family, and you expect us to what?" Applaud. Her hands were on her hips, her necklace glinting like armor, but I saw the crack in her facade the way her eyes darted to the letter on the floor. I shook my head, my voice steady. "I'm not walking away, Linda. I'm choosing myself." The words were a vow not just to her, but to the woman I'd been too afraid to be. I turned to James, my heart aching, but resolute. "You need to decide what you want, James, because I can't keep fighting your mother's battles for you." His face crumpled, a mix of guilt and fear, but he didn't speak, and that silence was answer enough for now. I started toward the door, my purse slung over my shoulder, but Sarah's voice stopped me. "Emily, wait," she said, standing, her voice trembling but clear. "I'll drive you home. You shouldn't be alone." Her offer was a lifeline, a small act of courage that cut through the tension. I nodded, grateful, my throat too tight to speak. Sarah grabbed her coat, ignoring Linda's glare, and I felt a spark of hope, a reminder that not everyone in this room was against me. As I moved toward the hallway, I caught sight of a small vase on the sideboard, filled with dried autumn leaves, their edges brittle and brown. It was a quiet detail, but it struck me as a mirror of this moment, something beautiful now faded, ready to be swept away. I paused, my hand brushing the locket at my neck, my mother's gift, and felt her strength steady me. I wasn't running. I was stepping into a fight I'd been avoiding for too long. Linda's voice followed me, sharp and desperate. "This isn't over, Emily. You'll see." But I didn't turn back. My steps were steady, each one a choice to reclaim my worth. The dining room voices faded, replaced by the creak of the front door as Sarah opened it, the cold November air rushing in. I wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was finally moving towards something real. The cold air hit my face as Sarah and I stepped onto the porch, the night sharp and quiet compared to the chaos inside. My breath clouded in front of me, and I clutched my purse tighter, the locket at my neck, a steadying weight. Sarah's car keys jingled in her hand, her face pale but determined, as she led the way to her sedan, parked under a bare oak tree. I followed, my heels crunching on the gravel, each step a declaration I hadn't realized I was ready to make. Linda's final words echoed in my mind, a threat I refused to let anchor me. I slid into the passenger seat, the leather cold through my dress, and Sarah started the engine, the hum filling the silence between us. "You were incredible in there," she said, her voice soft but firm, her eyes on the road as she pulled out. "I've never seen anyone stand up to Linda like that, not even James." Her words were a balm, soothing the raw edges of my heart, but they also stirred a question I couldn't shake. Why hadn't James? I stared out the window, the dark shapes of houses blurring past their windows, glowing with warmth I hadn't felt tonight. "I didn't want to hurt him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I couldn't keep pretending. Not for her, not for anyone. My fingers traced the locket, its smooth surface, a link to my mother's courage. A woman who'd faced her own battles with quiet steel. I'd spent so long trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law, that I'd forgotten how to be me. Sarah glanced at me, her expression soft. You did what you had to. James, he'll come around, or he won't. But you're not alone, Emily. Not anymore. Her words were a gift, a reminder that I'd found an ally in this fractured family. I knotted my throat tight and let the weight of her support settle over me, light but real. The drive was short, but it gave me space to think, to feel the shift inside me. I wasn't the woman who'd walked into that house hours ago hoping for acceptance. I was someone new, someone who'd chosen truth over silence, even at a cost. My mind drifted to the letter now lying on Linda's floor, its words no longer mine to carry. I'd exposed James's secret, but it wasn't about shame. It was about honesty, about refusing to let Linda's lies define me. When we reached my apartment, Sarah parked, but didn't turn off the engine. "You want me to come in?" she asked, her hand resting on the gear shift. I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I'm okay," I said, and for the first time tonight, I meant it. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." She squeezed my hand, her touch warm, and I stepped out, the night air sharp against my skin. I climbed the stairs to our apartment, my key cold in my hand as I unlocked the door. The space was dark, the faint scent of coffee lingering from this morning a lifetime ago. I didn't turn on the light. Instead, I walked to the living room window, the city lights a soft glow beyond the glass. My purse hit the floor with a soft thud, and I sank onto the couch, my dress crumpling around me. The locket gleamed faintly, catching the light, and I opened it, revealing a tiny photo of my mother, her smile fierce and kind. I thought of James, of the hurt in his eyes, and my chest ached. I loved him, but love wasn't enough if it meant losing myself. I needed him to see me, to choose me, not just as his wife, but as a partner who deserved respect. My mind flashed to a moment early in our marriage, a quiet night when we danced in this very room, laughing over spilled wine. We'd been a team then, or so I'd thought. Now I wasn't sure what we were, but I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. My phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "You're stronger than you know. Call me if you need me." I smiled, the words a spark in the dark, but I didn't reply. Instead, I stood, my movements deliberate, and walked to the bedroom. I pulled a suitcase from the closet, its zipper loud in the quiet. I wasn't packing to leave, not yet, but I needed to be ready to know I could walk away if James couldn't meet me halfway. Each item I folded, a sweater, a pair of jeans, was a choice, a step toward reclaiming my agency. I paused, catching my reflection in the bedroom mirror. My face was tired, but my eyes were alive, burning with a strength I hadn't seen in years. I thought of my mother, of the way she'd faced her illness with grace, never letting it dim her spirit. She'd taught me to fight not with shouts, but with quiet, unshakable resolve. I closed the suitcase, the sound a soft click, and stood in the center of the room, my hands steady at my sides. The door creaked open behind me, and I turned to see James, his coat dusted with frost, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He didn't speak, just looked at me, his eyes searching for something I wasn't sure I could give. I didn't move, didn't soften, but I held his gaze, my locket cool against my skin. In that moment, I wasn't just his wife. I was Emily, whole and unbroken, and whatever came next, I'd face it on my terms. James stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the hallway light. The frost on his coat caught the dim glow, tiny crystals glinting like stars against the dark fabric. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, searched mine, but I didn't move, didn't speak. The suitcase sat closed on the bed behind me, a quiet testament to the line I'd drawn. My locket rested against my collarbone, its weight a reminder of the strength I'd reclaimed. The apartment was silent save for the distant hum of the city beyond the walls, and in that stillness I felt the world shift. He stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click, his boots leaving faint wet marks on the hardwood. "Emily," he said, his voice rough, like he'd been shouting into the wind. I didn't know it would come to this. His words were careful, but they carried a tremor, a crack in the armor he'd worn all evening. I wanted to believe him, to see the man I'd married in that plea, but the memory of his silence at the table held me back. I crossed my arms, my fingers brushing the wool of my sweater, grounding me. "You didn't know," I said, my voice low, steady, but laced with a quiet fire. "James, you watched her tear me apart for years. You knew the truth, and you let me carry it alone." My words weren't loud, but they filled the room, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. His face tightened, a flicker of guilt passing over it, and he looked away, his gaze settling on the suitcase. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture familiar but distant, like a memory from another life. "I thought if I kept Mom at bay, if I didn't make waves, it'd be easier for us." He met my eyes again, his expression raw. "I was wrong. I see that now." His admission was a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading through me. Part of me wanted to reach for him to bridge the gap with forgiveness, but another part, the part that had stood up to Linda, that had packed that suitcase, held firm. "It's not just about tonight," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "It's about every time I felt like I was fighting for us alone." "I can't do that anymore, James." He nodded, his jaw tight, and for a moment, we just stood there, the space between us, a battlefield of unspoken hopes and failures. The apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of our shared history. I thought of the mornings we'd spent here, laughing over burnt toast, planning a future that seemed so certain then. Now that future was a question mark, and his apology, though genuine, wasn't enough to erase the doubt. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a sharp sound that broke the tension. I glanced at it, seeing Sarah's name flash on the screen. I didn't pick it up, but the message preview caught my eye. "Family's a mess. Caleb's actually sorry. Linda's losing it." My lips twitched, a faint spark of satisfaction at the thought of Linda unraveling, but it was fleeting. The real battle was here in this room, with the man I'd promised to love through anything. James followed my gaze to the phone, his shoulders sagging. "They're talking about it, aren't they?" he said, his voice flat. "The whole family picking apart what happened." He sank onto the edge of the couch, his hands clasped between his knees, and for the first time I saw how small he looked, stripped of the confidence he'd always carried. "I never wanted this, Emily. For you, for us." I stayed standing. My arms still crossed the locket, a quiet pulse against my skin. "Neither did I said, my voice softer now, but firm. "But I didn't start this. Your mother did, and you let her. Now we're here, and we can't pretend it didn't happen." My words were a mirror reflecting the truth we'd both avoided for too long. I saw it hit him, the way his shoulders tensed, his eyes dropping to the floor. The silence stretched heavy and unbroken until my phone buzzed again. I ignored it, but the sound was a reminder of the world outside this room, the family now fractured by the truth I'd laid bare. I thought of Sarah's text, of Caleb's unexpected remorse, and a strange calm settled over me. I'd shaken something loose, not just in Linda's carefully curated world, but in myself. I wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that dinner, and that knowledge was a quiet power steadying me even as my heart ached. James looked up, his eyes searching mine, and I saw the question there, the one he was too afraid to ask. Could we fix this? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. The suitcase on the bed was a possibility, not a decision, but its presence was enough to shift the air between us. I took a step toward him, not to comfort, but to confront, my voice low and clear. "We need to talk, James. Really talk. Because I'm not going back to the way things were." He nodded, his hands tightening around each other, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The city lights pulsed faintly, a rhythm that matched the slow beat of my heart, and I felt the weight of my choices settle over me, not as a burden, but as a truth I could carry. The apartment was a cocoon of quiet. James's nod hanging between us like a fragile thread. His hands, still clasped tightly, trembled slightly, and the faint city glow through the window cast long shadows across his face. I stood rooted, my words about needing to talk echoing in my mind, their weight settling into the stillness. My locket rested against my collarbone, its weight a reminder of the strength I'd reclaimed. The apartment was silent, save for the distant hum of the city beyond the walls, and in that stillness, I felt the world shift. He stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click, his boots leaving faint, wet marks on the hardwood. "Emily," he said, his voice rough, like he'd been shouting into the wind. I didn't know it would come to this. His words were careful, but they carried a tremor, a crack in the armor he'd worn all evening. I wanted to believe him, to see the man I'd married in that plea, but the memory of his silence at the table held me back. I crossed my arms, my fingers brushing the wool of my sweater, grounding me. "You didn't know," I said, my voice low, steady, but laced with a quiet fire. "James, you watched her tear me apart for years. You knew the truth, and you let me carry it alone." My words weren't loud, but they filled the room heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. His face tightened, a flicker of guilt passing over it, and he looked away, his gaze settling on the suitcase. "I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture familiar but distant, like a memory from another life. "I thought if I kept Mom at bay, if I didn't make waves, it'd be easier for us." He met my eyes again, his expression raw. "I was wrong. I see that now." His admission was a stone dropped into still water ripples spreading through me. Part of me wanted to reach for him to bridge the gap with forgiveness, but another part, the part that had stood up to Linda, that had packed that suitcase, held firm. "It's not just about tonight," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "It's about every time I felt like I was fighting for us alone." "I can't do that anymore, James." He nodded, his jaw tight, and for a moment we just stood there, the space between us, a battlefield of unspoken hopes and failures. The apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of our shared history. I thought of the mornings we'd spent here, laughing over burnt toast, planning a future that seemed so certain then. Now that future was a question mark, and his apology, though genuine, wasn't enough to erase the doubt. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a sharp sound that broke the tension. I glanced at it, seeing Sarah's name flash on the screen. I didn't pick it up, but the message preview caught my eye. "Family's a mess. Caleb's actually sorry. Linda's losing it." My lips twitched, a faint spark of satisfaction at the thought of Linda unraveling, but it was fleeting. The real battle was here in this room, with the man I'd promised to love through anything. James followed my gaze to the phone, his shoulders sagging. "They're talking about it, aren't they?" he said, his voice flat. "The whole family picking apart what happened." He sank onto the edge of the couch, his hands clasped between his knees, and for the first time, I saw how small he looked, stripped of the confidence he'd always carried. "I never wanted this, Emily. For you, for us." I stayed standing, my arms still crossed the locket, a quiet pulse against my skin. "Neither did I." I said, my voice softer now, but firm. "But I didn't start this. Your mother did, and you let her. Now we're here, and we can't pretend it didn't happen." My words were a mirror reflecting the truth we'd both avoided for too long. I saw it hit him, the way his shoulders tensed, his eyes dropping to the floor. The silence stretched heavy and unbroken until my phone buzzed again. I ignored it, but the sound was a reminder of the world outside this room, the family now fractured by the truth I'd laid bare. I thought of Sarah's text, of Caleb's unexpected remorse, and a strange calm settled over me. I'd shaken something loose, not just in Linda's carefully curated world, but in myself. I wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that dinner, and that knowledge was a quiet power, steadying me even as my heart ached. James looked up, his eyes searching mine, and I saw the question there, the one he was too afraid to ask. Could we fix this? I didn't have an answer, not yet. The suitcase on the bed was a possibility, not a decision, but its presence was enough to shift the air between us. I took a step toward him, not to comfort, but to confront, my voice low and clear. "We need to talk, James. Really talk. Because I'm not going back to the way things were." He nodded, his hands tightening around each other, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The city lights pulsed faintly, a rhythm that matched the slow beat of my heart, and I felt the weight of my choices settle over me, not as a burden, but as a truth I could carry. The morning light filtered through the cafe window, soft and gray, painting the wooden table in muted tones. I sat alone, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in my hands, its warmth seeping into my palms. The air smelled of fresh pastries and rain, a quiet contrast to the storm that had raged in my life for weeks. My journal lay open before me, its pages filled with jagged handwriting, a map of the thoughts I'd been untangling since that Thanksgiving night. I was 32, and for the first time, I felt like I was meeting myself. The cafe was a small place tucked on a side street near our apartment, its walls lined with mismatched bookshelves and faded art. I'd come here to think, to breathe away from the weight of James's searching eyes and the echoes of Linda's voice. My sweater, a soft blue I'd chosen this morning, felt like a shield wrapping me in a calm I hadn't known I could claim. I traced the rim of my mug, my nails catching on a tiny chip, and let my mind wander. I'd started journaling a week ago after our first counseling session with Ellen, a woman whose steady voice had cut through the fog of our pain. That day, James and I had sat across from her, the air between us fragile but honest. I'd spoken about the letter, about the years of carrying a truth that wasn't mine, and James had listened, his hands folded, his eyes wet. It wasn't a fix, but it was a start, a crack in the wall we'd built. I wrote about it in my journal, the words raw and unpolished, but mine. Now, as I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me, I flipped to a new page. My pen hovered, then pressed down, ink flowing, as I wrote about the woman I wanted to be. Not Linda's daughter-in-law, not even James's wife, but Emily, whole, unapologetic, free. The thought made my chest ache, not with pain, but with possibility. I'd spent so long defining myself through others, their expectations, a cage I hadn't seen until it broke. The cafe door chimed, and I glanced up to see Sarah step inside, her coat damp from the drizzle outside. She spotted me and smiled, a quiet warmth that felt like home. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, sliding into the chair across from me. Her hair was loose, curling slightly at the ends, and her presence was a comfort, a reminder of the unexpected ally I'd gained. "Not at all," I said, closing my journal, my fingers lingering on its cover. "It's good to see you." My voice was soft, but it carried a strength I hadn't noticed before, a steadiness that came from knowing my own worth. Sarah ordered a tea, her movements easy, and we sat in a companionable silence for a moment, the hum of the cafe wrapping around us. She leaned forward, her eyes searching mine. "You look different," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Not just tired, but lighter, like you're carrying less." Her words were a mirror reflecting a change I'd felt, but hadn't named. I smiled a small curve of my lips and nodded, unsure how to explain the shift. "I'm trying to figure out who I am," I said, my voice low, the words spilling out like a confession. "Not who I should be for everyone else, but me. It's scary, but it feels right." My fingers brushed the journal, its pages a testament to that journey. And I thought of the nights I'd spent writing each word a step toward clarity. Sarah's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, her hand resting near mine, not touching, but close. "You're doing it," she said, her voice firm. "I saw it that night, the way you stood up to Linda. You're not just fighting for a place anymore. You're claiming it." Her words were a gift settling into me like roots, and I felt a quiet pride, fragile but real. I took another sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through me, and looked out the window. The street was slick with rain, people hurrying under umbrellas, their lives a blur of motion. I used to feel like that, always rushing to meet someone else's expectations, but now in this moment, I was still anchored by my own choices. I thought of my mother, not the locket, but her laugh, the way it filled a room, and I realized I was carrying her forward, not as a memory, but as a part of me. The cafe hummed around us, a soft rhythm of clinking cups and murmured conversations, and I let myself breathe slow and deep. My journal sat closed, its secret safe, and Sarah's presence was a steady light. I wasn't healed, not yet, but I was here in this quiet space, learning to trust the woman I was becoming, and that was enough for now. Sarah's tea steamed in its cup, the faint scent of chamomile mingling with the cafe's warmth. The rain outside had softened to a drizzle, tapping the window like a quiet heartbeat. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking softly, and let my hands rest on the table, my journal, a silent companion between us. My sweater sleeves were slightly frayed at the cuffs, a detail I hadn't noticed before, and somehow it felt right, imperfect, like me, but still whole. Sarah sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "You know," she said, her voice low, "Linda called me yesterday. Said she's been thinking about what happened." She paused, setting her cup down with a gentle clink. She didn't apologize, not really, but she sounded shaken. Like she's starting to see the cracks in her own story. Her words were careful, not triumphant, just a fact laid bare. I knotted my fingers, tracing the edge of my journal, its cover worn from days of carrying it close. "I don't need her to say sorry," I said, my voice steady, almost a whisper. "I needed to stop letting her define me. That's enough." The truth of it settled over me, light as the rain outside, but solid like ground I could stand on. I'd spent so long chasing Linda's approval, but now I saw it for what it was, a trap I'd set for myself. Sarah's lips curved a quiet smile that held no judgment. "You're different, Emily," she said again, but this time her voice carried a note of wonder. "It's like you've found your own gravity." Her words struck deep, a recognition of the shift I felt, but hadn't named. I didn't need to be louder or angrier or right. I just needed to be me, and that was a kind of power I was only beginning to understand. I looked out the window, the street now empty, the drizzle catching the glow of a street lamp. My mind drifted not to the dining room or James's hurt, but to a memory I hadn't touched in years. I was 9, sitting on my mother's porch watching fireflies blink in the summer dusk. She'd handed me a jar, her hands gentle, and told me to catch just one to hold it for a moment before letting it go. Some things she'd said are only yours if you set them free. I'd laughed then, not understanding, but now her words came back clear and sharp. I was setting things free, not just Linda's expectations, but my own need to please, to prove. My coffee had cooled, but I took a sip anyway, the bitterness a quiet comfort. I thought of James, of the counseling sessions we'd committed to the slow work of rebuilding trust. He'd started setting boundaries with Linda, small ones like skipping her weekly dinners, and though it wasn't a cure, it was a step. I didn't know if we'd make it, but I knew I'd be okay with or without him. Sarah glanced at her watch, her expression reluctant. "I've got to run," she said, standing, her coat rustling. "But I'm here, Emily, anytime." She squeezed my shoulder, her touch brief but warm, and I knotted my throat tight with gratitude. She left the door chiming softly behind her, and I was alone again, the cafe's hum wrapping around me like a blanket. I opened my journal, the pages crisp under my fingers, and wrote a single line. "I am enough." The words were simple, but they carried a weight, a truth I'd fought to claim. I closed the book, my hands steady, and looked out at the rain-slicked street. The world felt quieter, not because the storm was over, but because I'd found a stillness within it. My mother's firefly lesson echoed a reminder that freedom wasn't in holding tight, but in letting go. I stood, slipping my journal into my bag, the strap heavy on my shoulder. The barista smiled as I passed her apron dusted with flour, and I returned it, a small gesture that felt like a bridge to the world. Outside, the air was cool, the drizzle kissing my face, and I paused under the street lamp, its light pooling around me. My sweater was damp, my shoes scuffed, but I felt whole like a firefly blinking in the dusk, free to shine on my own terms. The kitchen smelled of sage and butter, the air warm with the hum of our small Thanksgiving gathering. I stood at the counter, slicing carrots, my knife moving in steady, deliberate strokes. The apartment was alive with soft laughter, the clink of glasses, and the low crackle of a playlist I'd curated this morning. At 33, I was hosting my own table for the first time, not as a wife or a daughter-in-law, but as Emily Whole and unapologetic. The thought made my chest expand like a deep breath after years of holding it in. The table was set simply a white cloth with mismatched napkins, candles flickering in glass jars I'd found at a thrift store. Sarah was arranging a platter of roasted vegetables, her sleeves rolled up, her smile easy. Caleb, of all people, was here too, pouring wine with a sheepish grin, a far cry from the smirking kid who'd egged on Linda's cruelty a year ago. They were my chosen family, not bound by blood, but by something stronger, understanding. I paused, wiping my hands on a dish towel, its fabric soft from too many washes. The window was cracked open, letting in a cool November breeze that carried the faint hum of the city. I'd changed since that night, not in loud ways, but in the quiet choices that reshaped my days. I'd started running in the mornings, my sneakers pounding the pavement along the river, each step away to claim my body, my time. I'd filled my apartment with plants, their green leaves curling toward the light, a reminder that growth was slow but certain. James moved beside me, stirring a pot of gravy, his apron tied loosely. We were still navigating our way back to each other, our counseling sessions with Ellen peeling back layers of hurt and hope. He wasn't the same man who'd sat silent at his mother's table, and I wasn't the woman who'd begged for his defense. We were learning to meet in the middle to build something new. He caught my eye, his smile tentative but real, and I nodded, a small gesture that felt like a bridge. I thought of the letter I'd received from Linda last week, her handwriting stiff on thin paper. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but a concession, an acknowledgement that she'd misjudged me. I'd read it once, then tucked it into a drawer, its words no longer heavy. I didn't need her approval anymore. I'd found my own. The realization was a quiet victory, like the way the carrots yielded under my knife, precise and clean. Sarah called out, her voice bright. "Emily, these potatoes are perfect! You've got to teach me your secret!" She held up a golden wedge, her grin infectious, and I laughed, the sound lighter than I'd expected. "Just thyme and butter," I said, stepping over to adjust a candle on the table. The flame wavered, then steadied, and I felt a kinship with it, a resilience that didn't shout, but endured. Caleb raised his glass, his voice softer than I'd ever heard. To new traditions, he said, his eyes meeting mine, a flicker of respect there. We clinked glasses, the sound sharp and clear, and I took a sip, the wine tart on my tongue. I looked around the table at the faces I'd chosen, the space I'd carved out, and felt a warmth that wasn't just from the oven. This was my home, not because of where it was, but because of who I'd become within it. I returned to the counter, picking up my knife again, the handle smooth in my grip. The act of cooking, of creating something from raw pieces, felt like a metaphor for my life now. I wasn't fixed, not completely, but I was whole in a way I hadn't been before. The city hummed beyond the window, a steady pulse, and I let myself settle into the moment, the knife moving, the laughter, rising, my heart, quiet but full. The meal was winding down, plates scattered with crumbs, glasses half empty, the candles burning low. I leaned back in my chair, the wood warm against my spine, and watched Sarah and Caleb debate the merits of pecan pie over pumpkin, their voices light teasing. James sat beside me, his hand resting near mine on the table, not touching, but close, a quiet acknowledgement of the space we were rebuilding. The apartment felt alive, not just with sound, but with something deeper, a sense of belonging I'd crafted piece by piece over the past year. I stood to clear the plates, the clatter soft in the warm air, and caught my reflection in the kitchen window. My hair was loose, my face softer than it had been, the lines of tension smoothed by time and choice. I'd started painting again, a habit I'd abandoned in the chaos of pleasing others. My canvases, tucked in the corner of the spare room, were messy with color experiments and joy rather than perfection. Each brushstroke was a reminder that I could create not just for others, but for myself. As I stacked the dishes in the sink, the water running in a steady stream, I thought about the year since that Thanksgiving. James and I had faced hard truths in counseling, peeling back layers of hurt and hope. We'd begun exploring adoption not as a fix, but as a possibility, a way to build a family on our terms. The process was slow, daunting, but it felt honest, like a path we were choosing together. I didn't need a child to be whole, but I wanted to share the love I'd found within myself. Sarah joined me at the sink, drying a plate with a worn towel. "This was good," she said, her voice quiet, her eyes bright. "You made something real here, Emily." Her words landed softly like a leaf settling on water, and I knotted my throat tight. I thought of the nights I'd spent alone, questioning if I could ever feel this steady, this sure. The answer was here, in this kitchen, in the life I was shaping. I dried my hands and returned to the table where Caleb was telling a story about a work mishap. His hands animated, his laugh genuine. I sat my chair, creaking, and listened, letting the moment wrap around me. The candles flickered their light, dancing on the walls, and I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living not for approval or expectation, but for the quiet joy of being present, of being me. Later, after Sarah and Caleb had left James and I cleaned up in silence, our movements synchronized a rhythm we were relearning. He paused, a glass in his hand, and looked at me. "I'm glad we did this," he said, his voice low, steady. "I'm glad we're us." His words were simple, but they carried weight, a promise to keep trying. I smiled, a small curve of my lips, and nodded, letting the moment hold us. Alone in the living room, I sat on the couch, the apartment quiet now, the city a soft hum beyond the walls. I opened a small box I'd kept on the shelf, pulling out a single dried flower, its petals brittle but intact. I'd picked it on a walk months ago, a spur-of-the-moment act that felt like a gift to myself. I held it now, its fragility a mirror of the strength I'd found, not in being unbreakable, but in choosing to heal, to grow, even when it hurt. The lesson wasn't loud or grand. It was in the way I'd learned to forgive, not just Linda, not just James, but myself. I'd spent years believing my worth lay in what I could give others, a child, a perfect marriage, a flawless role. But freedom came when I stopped measuring myself by their scales. Love, I realized, wasn't about sacrifice. It was about showing up whole and honest for the people who saw you clearly. Family wasn't a name or a bloodline. It was the table you built, the hands you held, the stories you chose to tell. I set the flower back in its box, my fingers steady, and stood the floor cool under my bare feet. The night was still, the candles long extinguished, but their warmth lingered in me, a quiet flame that didn't need to roar to burn bright. I was enough, not because I'd won or proven anything, but because I'd chosen to be. What's a moment that made you realize your own worth? Share it below. I'd love to hear your story. If this touched you, leave a like, subscribe for more journeys like mine, and pass it along to someone who needs it. Thank you for being here, for listening. Here's to finding your light wherever you are.